The most expensive rule in society is not a law written in a book. It is the invisible rule that tells you the path to wealth is the same path that trains you to be obedient. That rule has kept more people average than any recession ever could, because once you believe it, the rest of your life begins organizing itself around a fatal misunderstanding. You study to prove compliance. You work to prove reliability. You wait to be rewarded for effort. You confuse being useful to the system with becoming powerful inside it, and by the time you realize those are different games, years are gone. That is the real trap. So let me give you the one mother line that everything in this story serves. The path that makes good workers is not the same path that makes owners, negotiators, or wealth builders. That is the line, not rebellion for its own sake, not illegal behavior, not empty bravado, rule interpretation. Because once you understand that, the whole social map changes. You stop asking only whether a rule is respectable. You start asking who the rule was built to serve, what kind of person the rule trains you to become, and whether following it moves you closer to ownership or keeps you inside service. That is the deeper game. Now let me show you the mechanisms. The first mechanism is worker programming. Most people are raised inside a sequence that looks so normal, they never question what it is optimizing for. Sit still. Follow instructions. Memorize what matters to the evaluator. Do not challenge authority too directly. Ask for permission. Get good grades. Earn credentials. Be punctual. Be reliable. Be pleasant enough to supervise. Then go to work and keep doing a grown-up version of the same thing. That is worker programming. I am not saying those behaviors have no value. They clearly do. What I am saying is that they build one kind of capability much more efficiently than they build another. They build compliance, legibility, and employability. They do not automatically build ownership, leverage, pricing power, or strategic independence. That is a huge distinction. A good student is often someone who reads the institution well and gives it what it wants. A wealthy builder is often someone who reads the institution well enough to know when, not to give it what it wants. Those are related skills. They are not the same skill. This is why so many high-achieving people feel betrayed later. They followed the formula exactly. They were disciplined, they got the grades, they did what the adults said would produce security, and yet they end up overworked, taxed, dependent on salary, and far less economically free than people who looked messier but built ownership instead. That is not because discipline failed. It is because discipline was pointed toward the wrong game. Now let us move to the second mechanism. I call it rule duality. There are always at least two kinds of rules operating in any hierarchy. The first kind is the public rule, the thing everybody is told: work hard, stay in your lane, do not take reckless risk, respect authority, pay what you owe, follow the proper path. The second kind is the private rule: learn negotiation, use leverage carefully, treat systems as movable, understand incentives, optimize taxes, acquire assets, take calculated risk when downside is survivable, push when the crowd is still waiting for permission. That is rule duality. The tragedy is that the poor and middle class are usually trained heavily in the first language and only weakly in the second, while wealthy environments often teach the second language from childhood without needing to announce that they are doing so. One child learns that rules are fixed boundaries. Another learns that rules are default settings, often bendable by confidence, expertise, lawyers, money, or timing. That difference compounds. A person who sees rules as walls stays inside them even when the wall only exists psychologically. A person who sees rules as negotiable studies, the hinges. That is why I say the deepest divide is not intelligence. It is interpretation. Now let us move to the third mechanism. I call it negotiated reality. This is where rich and poor environments produce radically different instincts. In lower power environments, survival often depends on obedience. The police are not there to negotiate with you. The boss can replace you, bureaucracy can stall you, one wrong move can cost too much. The rational response is often to become careful, compliant, and alert to punishment. In higher power environments, Children are often taught something else. Speak up, ask why, push back politely, request exceptions, appeal decisions, debate authority, ask the teacher, ask the dean, ask the manager, ask the banker, ask the lawyer, ask again. That is negotiated reality. The result is not merely a difference in manners. It is a difference in economic posture. One person enters adulthood assuming forms are final, rates are fixed, salary is assigned, institutions are impersonal, and authority is something you adapt to. Another enters adulthood assuming almost everything, has a negotiable layer, price, terms, access, exceptions, introductions, structures, and timing that is enormously important. Wealth is built far more often through negotiated reality than through obedient reality. Not because obedience has no place, because ownership requires more than obedience can teach. Now let us move to the fourth mechanism. I call it strategic rule breaking. This phrase scares people because they hear it as lawlessness. That is not what I mean. Most meaningful wealth building does not come from committing crimes. It comes from refusing the social and cultural rules that keep capable people economically boxed in. That is strategic rule breaking. Do not assume the standard career ladder is sacred. Do not assume debt is always bad rather than tool dependent. Do not assume a degree is always the highest return move. Do not assume a stable job is automatically lower risk than building an asset. Do not assume conventional politeness gets rewarded more than assertive self-positioning. Do not assume waiting your turn is wiser than building your own lane. These are not legal rules. They are social rules. And social rules are often the most effective cage, because breaking them feels morally dirty even when doing so would improve your life. The system does not need bars if shame is strong enough. It only needs to teach you that unconventional people are reckless, selfish, arrogant, unrealistic, or irresponsible. Then you will police yourself. That is the genius of the trap. Now let us move to the fifth mechanism. I call it risk asymmetry. One reason break the rules advice is often useless is that it ignores class structure. Risk is not experienced equally. A wealthy person can take a shot and miss while landing on savings, family backing, reputation, or a recoverable balance sheet. A poor person can take the same shot and miss into debt, eviction, family fallout, or years of financial damage. So when society glorifies boldness without pricing the safety net behind it, it turns privilege into virtue theater. That is risk asymmetry. The rich are often trained to manage risk. The poor are often trained to avoid it. That alone produces very different futures. But avoiding all risk does not create safety. It usually creates dependency. This is why the real skill is not fearlessness. It is calibrated rule breaking. Break the rule whose violation can move you upward without destroying your base if it fails. Ignore the norm that costs you social approval but buys you economic leverage. Question the script that locks you into labor while others accumulate ownership, but do it with mathematics, not ego. That is what adults miss when they turn this topic into slogans. The problem is not that rule breakers win automatically. The problem is that obedient people are often never taught how to evaluate which risks are worth taking. Now let us move to the sixth mechanism. I call it ownership migration. The deepest difference between worker rules and wealth rules is that worker rules are built around earning. Wealth rules are built around owning. That sounds obvious. It changes everything. A worker is taught to maximize salary, reputation, and compliance. An owner learns to maximize margin, control, equity, distribution, and asset accumulation. That is ownership migration. You can work hard for 20 years and still stay in the same game if all your gains come as tax labor income, and most of your energy goes into preserving employability. The moment you begin moving effort into systems that can keep paying without your constant presence, ownership in a business, equity in productive assets, revenue from something scalable, distribution from something you control, you have started migrating away from worker rules. That is the real break, not do not work hard. Work hard, but do not leave all the fruit inside the same game that rents your time and taxes your labor before you can convert it. The public path says become indispensable. The wealth path says become difficult to exclude from the upside. Those are two very different ambitions. Now let us move to the seventh mechanism. I call it social penalty. This is the price almost nobody wants to pay. When you stop following the respectable script, people notice, family notices, peers notice, coworkers notice. The community that once gave you identity may now give you friction. That is social penalty. You will look unstable before you look visionary. You will look arrogant before you look strategic. You will look unserious before the asset works. You will look irresponsible before the result explains the choice. The system relies on this delay because most people cannot tolerate being misunderstood long enough to compound outside the script. That is why conformity stays powerful even when conformity is expensive. The crowd usually punishes deviation before the market rewards it. If you cannot survive that emotional tax, you will keep converting your intelligence back into obedience every time the path gets socially hot. That is one reason becoming wealthy often requires more than ambition. It requires insulation from the need to be immediately approved. Now I want to force the identity shift, because without it, this still sounds like a motivational rant instead of a real operating philosophy. Stop thinking like a rule follower. Start thinking like a rule analyst. A rule follower asks, what am I supposed to do? A rule analyst asks, what is this rule optimized for, and for whom? A rule follower wants permission. A rule analyst wants leverage. A rule follower sees a path. A rule analyst sees a training system. That is the stronger identity. Because once you think that way, you stop rebelling randomly and start moving strategically. You do not break rules because rebellion feels exciting. You break or reinterpret the rules that train you for dependency when your actual goal is ownership. And now let me give you the operating system plainly. First, identify which rules in your life are making you more employable but not more powerful. Second, separate legal rules from cultural rules. The latter are often the ones quietly holding you in place. Third, learn negotiation. Salary, contracts, terms, price, access, structure, all of it matters more than blind compliance. Fourth, use debt with classification, not fear. Consumption debt usually weakens you asset. Linked or cash flow. Linked debt can strengthen you if you understand the downside. Fifth, migrate effort toward ownership. If all gains come through salary, you are still inside worker geometry. Sixth, calibrate risk. Break the rules you can survive breaking. Do not imitate privileged risk without privileged backup. Seventh, get comfortable with social disapproval. Wealth rarely grows on the same timetable as public approval. That is the heart of it. Getting rich does not require becoming immoral, illegal, or chaotic. It requires understanding that many of the rules you were taught were never designed to make you wealthy. They were designed to make you legible, useful, and governable. That is a very different mission. Now let me end where this really matters. You can keep following the path that produces praise, stability, and respectable dependence. You can keep believing the system will eventually reward obedience with ownership if you just do the same thing longer. You can keep calling unconventional people reckless while quietly envying the leverage they built outside the script. Or you can do the harder thing. You can ask which rules are protecting you and which rules are containing you. You can begin shifting from worker logic to owner logic. You can stop treating authority as sacred and start treating it as something to read, negotiate, and work around. You can build a life where your upside is no longer capped by how well you follow instructions. That is the threshold, because the people who become wealthy are not always the smartest people in the room. They are often the people who realized earlier that the room was teaching them the wrong game. That is the mirror. Look into it carefully. If you are still being rewarded mainly for obedience, then whatever path you are on may be making you useful. It is not necessarily making you rich.